The wind did not howl. It screamed. It was a physical thing, a solid wall of ice and needle-sharp snow that tore at Elias Thorne's oilskin coat and threatened to rip him from the saddle. Beneath him, Copper, his steadfast horse, lowered his head and drove forward, each step a monumental effort against the white fury. The world had vanished, replaced by a churning, blinding chaos. There was no up, no down, only the gale and the biting cold that felt less like a temperature and more like a malevolent presence. Elias leaned low over Copper's neck, his face a mask of frozen grit. He could not see the cabin, but he did not need to. He knew the path by the feel of the land beneath Copper's hooves, by the slight dip and rise of the terrain he had memorized over countless trips. He trusted the horse. Copper trusted him. In this maelstrom, that was the only law that mattered. The air burned in his lungs, each breath a painful, freezing gasp. Visibility was less than an arm's length. This was not a storm. It was the end of a world. Then, a shape loomed out of the whiteness, a low, dark silhouette that was more a feeling than a sight. The cabin. He slid from the saddle, his legs stiff and clumsy with cold. He kept a firm grip on Copper's reins, his knuckles white and numb. The barn was part of the cabin, a contiguous structure built into the hillside. He fumbled with the heavy wooden latch on the barn door, his fingers thick and useless as sausages. The wind tore the door from his grasp the moment it was unlatched, slamming it inward with a deafening crash. He pulled Copper into the sudden, shocking stillness of the small barn, the horse's breath pluming in great, ragged clouds. He forced the door shut, his entire body straining against the pressure of the wind. The bar fell into its slot with a solid, reassuring thud. For a moment, he just stood there in the semi-darkness, the scent of hay and horse filling his lungs, the roar of the blizzard, now a muffled, distant beast. He ran a hand over Copper's trembling flank. They were safe. For now. He moved through the connecting door into the single room of the cabin. A wave of gentle, radiant warmth washed over him, melting the ice from his beard. The great ceramic stove in the center of the room, his folly, his madness, was a silent, monolithic giant, pulsing with a deep and steady heat. The air inside was 71 degrees. Outside, it was a death sentence. 6 months earlier, the air had been thick with the promise of summer, not the threat of winter. Elias stood in the office of Mayor Albright, the town of Providence Creek's most important man. A plat map was unrolled on the desk between them, showing the neat grid of plots that would one day be a thriving community. Albright, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, pointed a thick finger at a square on the edge of the settlement. "That's your parcel, Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being right. "Good timber, decent access to the creek. You'll have a standard cabin up before the first frost, I expect. Like the Miller place or the Davies farm. Good, solid log construction." Elias looked at the map, but saw something else entirely. He saw wind patterns, snowdrifts, and the brutal, unforgiving logic of a high-country winter. He had been a cavalry scout for 15 years, tasked with surviving in places that wanted him dead. He had seen what a blizzard could do to good, solid log construction. He had seen men freeze to death, huddled around roaring fires that consumed a week's worth of wood in a single night. "The cabin will be different," Elias stated, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm banking it into the south-facing slope of the hill, and the heart of it will be the stove." Albright leaned back, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "A stove? Well, of course, man. No one expects you to live without a stove. A good cast-iron potbelly will see you right. Not a potbelly, Elias corrected him gently. A Kachelofen, a masonry stove, German design. He used the old world term, the one he had learned from a farmer in the Black Forest during a long-ago campaign. The farmer's home had been warm, impossibly warm, through a winter that had decimated the local garrison. The mayor's amusement turned to a condescending smile. He exchanged a look with the town surveyor, Mr. Gable, who was leaning against the wall. Gable allowed himself a small, superior smirk. A whatten ofen? Albright chuckled. Thorne, we use iron stoves here. They are efficient. They are modern. You build a big fire, you get a big heat. Simple. And you feed it all day and all night, Elias countered. You burn through a cord of wood in a week. The heat blasts you on one side and leaves the other to freeze. When the fire dies, the cold comes in like a wolf. The masonry stove is different. It holds the heat. You burn a small, hot fire for 2 hours, and the ceramic mass radiates a gentle, even warmth for the next 24. Gable pushed himself off the wall. He means a brick fireplace, Mayor. We all know how well those work. They draw all the heat right up the chimney. It is not a fireplace, Elias said, his patience wearing thin. The smoke and gases do not go straight up. They travel through a series of channels, a maze of flues inside the stove's mass. By the time the smoke leaves the chimney, almost all of the heat has been absorbed into the bricks and clay. It is a thermal battery. Mayor Albright held up a hand, his smile now one of pity. Son, I admire your creativity, but we have ways of doing things here, proven ways. Building some kind of brick labyrinth in your cabin sounds like a fool's errand. It will take you all summer. And for what? Just buy a potbelly stove from the catalogue. It will cost you $12. My way will cost me nothing but my labor, Elias said. The clay is in the creek bed, the stones are on the hill. I will make the fire bricks myself. The mayor sighed, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. Do as you will, Thorne. It's your time to waste. But when the first blizzard hits and you're freezing in your brick box, don't come to us for help. We'll all be warm in our sensible cabins by our sensible iron stoves. The dismissal was clear. The conversation was over. The story of Elias Thorne's brick box spread through Providence Creek like a grass fire. It became the town's favorite joke. Men drinking at the saloon would laugh about Thorne's folly. They called it his clay oven and his mud house. Children would sneak up to the edge of his property to watch the madman digging in the dirt, hauling rocks, and mixing mud with his bare hands. Elias paid them no mind. He had been an outcast before. His competence had always been his only true companion, and it had never failed him. He chose his site carefully. A gentle, south-facing slope that would drink in the winter sun and be sheltered from the north wind by the bulk of the hill itself. He dug into the earth, creating a level platform with the hill forming the back wall of his future home. The excavation was brutal, back-breaking work. He used copper to drag the larger rocks away, the horse straining in the harness, sensing the urgency of the task. He laid a foundation of massive field stones, dug from the hillside, and fitted together with a skill that seemed more art than craft. This was not just a foundation for the cabin walls. It was the footing for the heart of the home, the great stove that would weigh nearly 5 tons. It had to be perfect. It had to be unmovable. While the townsfolk built their cabins quickly, racing to raise log walls and nail down plank floors, Elias spent a full month just on the ground beneath his home. Then came the work of the stove itself. This was a slow, methodical process, a form of communion with stone and fire. He sourced his clay from the banks of the creek a mile downstream, testing it for plasticity and content. He needed a specific type of fire clay, one that could withstand immense thermal stress without cracking. He found it in a thick grey seam, 20 feet from the water's edge. For weeks, he dug it out, loaded it onto a stone boat, and had Copper drag it back to his home site. He mixed the clay with sand and grog, clay he had already fired and crushed into a coarse powder.
This mixture would reduce shrinkage and improve the final brick's strength. He built a wooden mold, a simple rectangle, and began the painstaking process of forming his own fire bricks. He packed the clay mixture into the mold, smoothed the top, and carefully turned the wet brick out onto a drying rack he had built in the sun. He made hundreds. Each one was a small promise of future warmth. As the bricks dried, he worked on the outer structure of the cabin. He used the earth he had excavated to form thick, rammed earth walls on the east and west sides, insulated with a layer of straw. The front wall, facing south, was traditional log construction, but with massive double-paned windows he had salvaged from an abandoned government outpost. The roof was a shallow pitch, designed to hold a heavy load of snow, which he knew was one of nature's greatest insulators. He built the barn as an extension of the cabin on the west side, a single integrated structure. The body heat from copper would contribute to the warmth of the home. Every detail was a calculation. Every action had a purpose. Once the bricks were bone dry, he built a temporary kiln, a simple updraft design, and began firing them. He kept the fire low at first, a process of water smoking to drive out the last of the moisture without causing the bricks to explode. Then he slowly raised the temperature, feeding the fire for 3 days straight, sleeping in short bursts beside the glowing kiln. He watched the color of the flame, the color of the bricks inside, judging the temperature by eye and experience. When they glowed a bright orange-yellow, he knew they were vitrified, transformed from fragile clay into ceramic stone. With his materials prepared, the true construction of the Kachelofen began. He laid the fire bricks for the firebox, the core where the combustion would happen. It was a compact, squarish design. He understood that a small, intensely hot fire was far more efficient than a large, lazy one. A hot fire burned the wood gases completely, extracting every possible unit of heat and leaving behind minimal creosote. Above the firebox, the true genius of the design took shape. He began to build the flue channels, a winding, serpentine path for the hot gases. The smoke would not simply rise and exit. It would be forced to travel up, then horizontally, then down, then up again. A labyrinth of brick and mortar designed to bleed the heat from the exhaust. He built a bell at the top, a large chamber where the hottest gases would collect and linger, giving up their energy before being drawn down into the next channel. It was like building a 3-dimensional puzzle, and each brick had to be laid with precision, the mortar joints kept thin and tight. He worked from memory, from the sketches he had made in a journal years ago after observing the German farmer. He remembered the logic of it. Heat rises. So, you force it to travel down against its nature. This slows the exhaust, increasing the time the heat can be absorbed by the stove's mass. The outer skin of the stove was made of thicker, less dense bricks and covered in a thick plaster of clay and sand. This outer layer was designed to be a gentle radiator, to release the stored heat slowly and evenly. As he worked, the mockery from the town continued. The Miller boys, sons of his nearest neighbor, would sometimes ride by and yell things. "Still playing in the mud, Thorn?" they'd shout, laughing as they galloped away. Jed Miller himself, a decent but conventional man, stopped by once. He stood, arms crossed, looking at the half-finished brick monolith that dominated the small cabin.
Thorn, I don't mean no disrespect, Miller had said, shaking his head. But that thing is going to eat up all your living space. And what if it don't work? My potbelly was heating the cabin an hour after I set it up. This isn't meant to be fast, Jed, Elias had replied, without looking up from his work. It's meant to be permanent. The final piece of the design was the chimney. It was relatively short, exiting through the thick roof near the back of the cabin. By the time the exhaust gases reached the chimney, they were so cool that he knew he could hold his hand in the smoke without discomfort. That was the test. If the chimney was hot, you were wasting heat. His chimney would be cool. All the energy would remain inside, stored in the 5-ton ceramic heart of his home. He finished the stove in late September. The final step was the curing process. He had to build a series of small, progressively larger fires over the course of 2 weeks to slowly drive the moisture out of the mortar and the plaster. To rush it would be to crack the entire structure. It was an exercise in patience. While his neighbors were busy splitting and stacking massive piles of firewood, anticipating a winter of constant feeding, Elias laid in a surprisingly modest supply. He knew he would need less than a quarter of what they did. As autumn deepened, the signs began to appear. Elias, who read the land and the sky like other men read books, saw them clearly. The squirrels were frantic, their caches overflowing. The geese had flown south a full 3 weeks earlier than usual. The nights grew cold with an unusual speed, the air crisp and sharp in a way that spoke of a deep, abiding freeze to come. One afternoon in early November, he rode Copper into Providence Creek for supplies. The air was still, unnaturally so. The sky had a strange, pearlescent grey quality, a luminous ceiling that seemed to press down on the valley. The usual chatter in the general store fell silent as he entered. He was an unsettling presence to them, a man who lived by a different set of rules. He ignored the stares and bought his flour, salt, and coffee. As he was tying the bags to Copper's saddle, Mayor Albright stepped out of his office. "Well, Thorn," he said, his tone smug. "Winter is almost upon us. How is your great clay experiment?" "It is ready," Elias said simply, checking the knots. "Good, good," the mayor said, with a nod that was pure condescension. "We're expecting a bit of a blow tonight. A few inches of snow, they say. I do hope your mud house holds up." He laughed at his own joke. A few men nearby joined in. Elias looked up from his saddle. He gazed at the strange, luminous sky. He felt the dead stillness in the air. He saw the way the smoke from the town's chimneys rose straight up, then seemed to flatten out, trapped by an invisible lid. "Mr. Albright," he said, his voice low and serious. "This is not a few inches of snow coming. Bar your windows, bring your livestock inside, and stack your firewood by the door. You will not be able to get to your woodpile by morning." The mayor's smile faltered for a second, then returned, broader than before. He laughed loudly. "Listen to him, Old Man Winter himself. Thorn, you've spent so much time alone, you're starting to see ghosts in the clouds. It's a flurry, nothing more." He clapped Elias on the shoulder. "You take care of yourself, you hear?" Elias simply swung himself up onto Copper. He looked down at the mayor, his face impassive. "I will." He turned the horse and rode out of town without another word. He did not look back. He knew what was coming. The mocking laughter followed him until he was out of earshot. Back at his cabin, he made his final preparations. He brought extra buckets of water in from the well. He double-checked the latches on the barn door and the single window. He filled the wood box beside the stove, not because he would need it all, but because it was good practice. Copper was restless in his stall, pawing at the packed earth and shifting his weight. The horse knew.
Animals always knew. Elias lit the stove, loading the small firebox with seasoned oak. The fire caught quickly, roaring to life with a clean, intense heat. He let it burn for just under 2 hours, until the wood was reduced to a bed of glowing coals. Then he sealed the airtight firebox door and the chimney damper. The work of the stove was done. Now it would release its stored warmth for the next day. The first flakes of snow began to fall just after dusk. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a common snowfall. They were small, hard and dense, like pellets of sand. They fell silently at first, then with a soft hiss. The wind began to pick up, a low moan from the north. Within an hour, the moan had become a shriek. The blizzard descended. Inside the cabin, Elias sat at his small wooden table, cleaning his rifle by the light of a kerosene lamp.
The world outside raged, but inside, a profound and gentle peace reigned. There was no draught. The thick walls and banked earth construction were impervious to the gale. The only sound was the muffled, distant roar of the storm. And the warmth. It was a silent, radiant heat that came from the great ceramic stove. It was not the scorching, directional heat of an iron stove. It was an ambient warmth that filled the entire space evenly. The floor was warm. The walls were warm. The air itself felt soft and welcoming. He thought of the townsfolk in Providence Creek. He thought of their flimsy, draughty cabins, chinked with mud that would be shrinking and cracking in the intense cold. He pictured them huddled around their pot-belly stoves, feeding them constantly, the metal glowing cherry red, while the corners of the room were cold enough to freeze water. He imagined the immense stacks of firewood they would be burning through, and the cold dread they would feel as the pile dwindled. He took no pleasure in the thought.
He had warned them. Sometime after midnight, a new sound cut through the storm's howl. It was a frantic, desperate banging on his door. Elias took the lamp and opened it. A figure stumbled in, covered head to toe in snow, collapsing onto the floor. It was Jed Miller. His face was a mask of ice and terror. "Help!" he gasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Please, my family." Elias helped him to a chair near the stove. He wrapped a thick wool blanket around the man's shoulders. "What happened, Jed?" "The fire," Miller rasped, his voice raw. "We were pushing the stove so hard. The stovepipe got red hot. It set the roof on fire. We got out, but the cabin is gone. The roof caved in. We're in the lean-to with the animals, but Sarah, the children, they won't last the night. It's so cold." He was sobbing now, a broken man. "I was a fool, Thorne. A damned fool." Elias's face was grim. He wasted no time.
He pulled on his heavy oilskin coat and boots. He grabbed a coil of rope and 2 more blankets. "Stay here. Keep warm. I'll bring them back." He went into the barn. Copper whinnied softly, his warm breath fogging in the lantern light. Elias saddled him quickly, his movements efficient and sure. "Just a short trip, boy," he murmured, stroking the horse's powerful neck. "To the Miller place and back." Leading Copper out of the barn was like stepping off a cliff into a roaring sea. The wind knocked him back a step, and the snow was now waist-deep in drifts. He could see nothing but the churning white vortex in the small circle of his lantern's light. But he knew the way. He had walked this land 1,000 times. He kept the slight rise of the ridge to his left. He trusted his memory. He trusted his horse. The journey to the Miller homestead, normally a 10-minute walk, took him nearly an hour. He found what was left of the cabin, a smouldering,
snow-covered ruin.
The lean-to was a small, three-sided structure, and huddled inside were Sarah Miller and her two small children, a boy and a girl. They were wrapped in singed blankets, shivering violently, their faces pale and blue in the lantern light. There was no time for words. Elias worked quickly. He wrapped the children in the thick wool blankets he had brought. He lifted the little girl, who was no more than 5, and placed her in front of him on the saddle, instructing her to hold on tight. He had Sarah lift the boy up behind him. Then he helped Sarah mount behind the boy. He took the reins and began the slow, treacherous walk back, leading the heavily laden horse through the blizzard. Copper never faltered. The horse seemed to understand the preciousness of his cargo, placing each hoof with deliberate, certain care. When they finally stumbled back into the warmth and stillness of Elias's cabin, it was like entering another world.
Jet Miller rushed to his family, his face a mixture of relief and shame.
Elias helped them out of their wet things and sat them close to the stove. The ceramic was not hot to the touch. It was just deeply, wonderfully warm. The children, who had been shivering uncontrollably, slowly began to relax, their pale skin regaining its color. Sarah Miller looked around the small, simple room, at the solid walls, the dry floor, and the silent, monolithic stove that was effortlessly holding the deadliest winter in a generation at bay. She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. The Miller family stayed with Elias, safe and warm. They ate his food, slept on his floor, and never once felt the cold. Twice a day, Elias would open the stove for 2 hours, burn a small, hot fire, and then seal it again. The temperature inside the cabin never dropped below 70 degrees.
It was a small island of life in a world of white death. On the morning of the 3rd day, they awoke to silence. The wind had stopped. Elias opened the door to a world transformed. The snow was piled in immense drifts, 12 feet high in places, sculpted by the wind into alien shapes. The sun was brilliant on the new snow, the light so bright it was painful to look at. The air was frigid, but clean and still. Later that day, a group of men arrived from Providence Creek. They were led by Mayor Albright. They had struggled through the massive drifts on snowshoes, their faces grim. They stopped and stared at Elias's cabin. It was the only structure they had seen that was wholly intact. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, not the frantic, billowing smoke of a desperate fire, but the calm, thin plume of an efficient one. Mayor Albright looked at the rescued Miller family, then at the great stove, and finally at Elias. The mayor's usual bluster was gone, replaced by a deep, weary humility.
"Thorn," he said, his voice quiet. We were wrong. Terribly wrong." He told the story. 6 cabins had burned down, just like the Millers, from overheated stovepipes. 2 families had been found frozen in their homes, their firewood inaccessible, or their fires gone out. The town's supply of cut wood was nearly exhausted. The survivors were huddled in the meeting hall, burning the furniture to stay warm. Providence Creek had been broken. "Your cabin," Gable, the surveyor, said, his voice full of awe as he ran a hand over the warm plaster of the stove. It's like a fortress. We saw the smoke. We didn't know if you were alive, but we knew if anyone was, it would be you." Elias just nodded. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so" on his lips.
There was only a quiet sorrow for the lives that had been lost to ignorance and pride.
"The clay is in the creek bed," he said simply. The stones are on the hill. When the thaw comes, I will show you how to build." And he did. That spring, Elias Thorne did not build one kachelofen. He taught the entire community of Providence Creek how to build them. He oversaw the construction of a dozen of the great masonry stoves in the new, better insulated cabins they built to replace the ones they had lost. They no longer called it Thorne's Folly. They called it Thorne's Heart, for it was the warm, beating heart of a home. The town was rebuilt, not on the principle of speed and convenience, but on the hard-won wisdom of survival. The cabins were banked into hillsides, the roofs were designed to hold the insulating snow, and in the center of every home stood a massive ceramic stove, a silent testament to the quiet veteran who had listened to the land instead of to the laughter of men.
Elias Thorne lived in his cabin for another 30 years. He never married, content with the company of the mountains, the seasons, and a long line of steadfast horses, though none ever quite replaced copper in his heart. The stove he built outlasted him. It became a local landmark, and travellers caught in sudden storms knew that Thorne's cabin was a place of certain sanctuary. The stove never failed. The cabin never grew cold. The story became a legend in that part of the country, a lesson passed down from one generation to the next. It was a story about a blizzard, a cabin, and a horse. But more than that, it was a story about the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is knowing how to build a fire to stay warm for a night. Wisdom is knowing how to build a stove that will keep your grandchildren warm through the worst winter in 100 years. Sometimes, wisdom looks like madness to those who have not yet learned to see.
But like the slow, steady heat of the masonry stove, it endures, long after the fires of foolish pride have burned themselves out.